Slovak Republic historically was less developed than Czech part of Czechoslovakia, not only from point of view of historical development, also from point of view of creating of elites who are prepared for the change. It was fortunate for Slovakia that Slovakia was part of Czechoslovakia at the beginning of transition process in 1992, because at that time Slovakia was part of country which did really good and radical reform, similar reform that was started 1 year before, from January 1990 in Poland. Then we had a very bad period of Mečiar leadership between 92 and 98, when Slovakia was isolated not only politically and excluded from the integration to NATO, to OECD, to European Union. Slovakia was at that time a rural country, which means majority of Slovakian economy was constructed during communism. It means also the bad structure of economy, mostly based on heavy industry, heavy military equipment, which nobody bought, and economy was much more interconnected with the former Soviet Union and socialist countries, Comecon countries. And after collapse of this market, Slovakian economy had bigger recession as Czech economy. Which means in this regard, Slovakia had really difficult situation. And during Mečiar time, during first time of transition, it was no restructuring. It was just macro stabilization, liberalization, and all these issues, starting of privatization. And then during Mečiar time, it was no restructuring. Also because it was no foreign direct investment. Also because economic policy was very wrong. We can say that economic policy was similar than in Ukraine before Euromaidan, which means dysfunctional, corrupted economy. Privatization was done partially, but in very crony methods, to simply giving companies almost free of charge to political allies. Yeah, the beginning of first Zurinda's government, it was at the end of 98. When we started, it was really difficult because more reasons. First one was legacy, which we inherited. And another difficulty was that we had very broad coalition. 9 political parties were there. To eliminate Mečiar, who still won elections in 98 and also in 2002, all other parties have to unify and create very broad coalition. And the biggest problem was that former communists, who were also part of this coalition, they were against necessary stabilization measures, against increasing some taxes, against reducing some expenditures, because we had huge deficit and current account deficit and so on. And then it was simply impossible to have consensus. And then what was interesting, markets became more and more nervous. And in April 99, it was steep and quick devaluation of the currency. And only then we pushed all coalitions, especially these former communists, to start with macro stabilization policy. We did it, and then it brought really quick results. But still, the first Zurinda's government had the problem that it was impossible to do more radical changes. For instance, we were from the beginning convinced that it is necessary to simplify tax system and reduce tax rate. We were convinced that it is necessary to do other structural reforms, but they were afraid from political point of view, because their background, they were against market, they didn't feel trust to market economy, to business and so on. So it was very difficult, which means we did what was possible to do in this kind of broad coalition. But what is interesting, that despite that they were afraid to do reforms because they felt some threat for their popularity, finally they were the party who failed in elections in 2002. And that was the reason why in 2002 it was window of opportunity which was created by the situation when 4 center-right parties had enough to create much more homogeneous and pro-reform government. This was the main political precondition for this, the most successful reform second Zurinda's government between 2002 and 2006. We recovered banking sector. We imposed macroeconomic stability, which means we reduce fiscal deficit, we reduce current account deficit, we open country for the foreign investors. We did deregulation of the energy prices, for instance, what Ukraine did as well, because before, during Mečiar, also prices were deformed and administratively held much lower. Which means we did this kind of macro stabilization measures, improvement, the biggest disbalances inherited from Mečiar time, and then in second Zurinda's government we did really deep reforms. The second government started in end of 2002. All 2003 year we spent by preparation of the new legislation necessary for these new reforms, which means new system, new economic system started from January 1st, 2004. And at the same time, Slovakia entered European Union in May 1st, 2004. In 2003, which was decisive from point of view of legislation, government proposed 209 laws to the parliament and sent to the parliament. Almost all of them were passed in the parliament. 208 out of 209 were passed. Just one was not supported in the parliament, which is, for instance, very big difference in comparison with Ukraine in 2015, when only about 1/3 of government proposals were passed in parliament, which means this was very important. And then what we did last stage of deregulation of prices. We changed public finance by imposing hard budgetary constraints and strict rules for creating budget and for limitation of the extensive expenditures. Then it was tax reform. Then it was fiscal decentralization. Then social system reform, pension reform, labor market reform, and healthcare reform. These 7 bold reforms were prepared and started from beginning of 2004. It was, even for us who prepared this, the results were even better than we expected. Then it was really very high economic growth. For instance, in 2000, our growth was 1.4%, which is similar than today in Ukraine. In 2004, in the first year of these really big reforms, it was 5%. But in 2007, it was more than 10%, 10.5%. It was a lot of foreign direct investment who influxed to Slovakia. This may be the biggest achievement. At the same time, we reduced the size of the state, and at the same time, we had more money for the public service, and not only, we changed also functioning of the public services, which means we have more money in a better functioning system of healthcare, of social system, of education, and on pensions. Which means it was possible, on one side, reduce the size of the state, reduce tax burden, measuring as share to GDP, or maybe the best illustration how bold and complex the reforms can bring, how quick improvement is our rating, Slovakian rating. In 2000, Slovakia had 4 levels worse rating, Standard & Poor's investment rating, in comparison with Czech Republic and Hungary, and 3 levels below Poland. In 2005, after doing these reforms, Slovakia had the best rating among these Visegrad 4 countries. 1 level above Czech Republic and Hungary, and 2 levels above Poland. It was even a jump, not only regarding convergence, regarding economic growth, regarding approaching the Western European countries by GDP per capita, it was really jump. Which means it is not theoretical, but really empirical evidence that it works. That if reforms are done complexly enough, comprehensively enough, and radical enough, they will bring really quick results. But of course, reforms are much more political problem than technical one. Technically, we know what to do. We have now a lot of experiences from more than 25 years of experiences from many countries. But what is the most important is why, to answer on the question, why some countries were much more successful than other countries. And if we are speaking about more successful, we have to speak about economic growth. From economic point of view, this is the goal. This is not the final goal. Final goal is to improve living conditions, quality of life, living of standard of the people. But you can improve this only if you have growing and functioning economy, of course. Which means the best indicator for me is economic growth or convergence progress, which means how quickly we are approaching the economic level of the most developed countries. And in these regards, I think it is clear that there are 5, 6 the most successful countries. There are 3 Baltic countries, there is Poland, there is Georgia, there is Slovakia. What is the common for these countries is that these countries did more reforms, more radical reforms, more complex reforms. But for doing it politically, it is necessary, of course, to have power, firstly. Then you have vision, will, and courage to do it, to have leaders who will do it despite of political costs or political risks connected with this. You have to be convinced that you are doing this reform not because European Union is pushing or financial markets are pushing you to do it, but because you are convinced that it is important. If you are not convinced, that you cannot convince others, which means voters, people, that it is important, it is necessary. And in Slovakian case, it was, of course, also difficult. We had, by public opinion polls in 2003, 2004, when we were considered the most reformed country in the world, by the public opinion polls, Slovakian people distrust to government was historically the biggest. Their fears from the future were the biggest. Of course, also because opposition, socialistic opposition and populists and trade unions created and even increased these fears. At that time, in 2004, in April, we had referendum about firing government, about shortening election term for the government. And what is interesting, despite that majority of people distrust government, majority of people felt fears from the future, by public opinion polls, about 75% of people, only 32% of people came to this referendum. And we have 50% result for the validity of the referendum, which means the referendum was invalid. And then we continued. And then, because reforms are finally about trust, about confidence, about politics. And this is very, very, very interesting because on one side, people were afraid, and this is normal. And this is what is very important for the reforms. This is normal. And that's the reason why it is difficult to do reforms. Because in human nature, it is, and psychologists know it, there are a lot of evidences for this, that risk aversion is the normal human characteristic or feature, which means people are afraid from the change. But at the same time, people are not such stupid that they will reject, because people in Slovakia, why they didn't attend this referendum? Because they were afraid, but at the same time they felt that these opponents are not offering real alternative. They are just criticizing, just against. But they felt that there is no free lunch, that it is simply impossible to do something what is necessary without also some cost and some pains. Good question, because I think that much more important than particular reforms is complexity. I don't like speak about one reform, because reforms will bring results only if there is change of the of the system, which means they are interconnected. For instance, you can do macro stabilization, reducing fiscal expenditures by one-time measures, but you cannot sustain it without structural reforms. You cannot have functioning market economy without sound banking sector. And everything is interconnected like this. You cannot have a functioning market economy without foreign investment. You cannot have foreign investment without privatization. If you have so many state-owned companies, as for instance today still in Ukraine, 3,500. You cannot fight against corruption if you will not provide deregulation, liberalization, and privatization. But of course, very open and transparent privatization. Which means, and this is the point, in economy, everything is interconnected like this. Which means, answering this question, what is the most important? In my opinion, the most important is liberalization, deregulation, and privatization. And I will add property right protection. I will tell it in four another groups. First one is everything what is connected with macro stabilization. Second one, everything what is connected with business environment, including law enforcement and property right protection. Everything which is connected with public service efficiency, public administration efficiency, and then everything connected with knowledge economy, which means education, science, research, technology, and this is the point. If we will do only one, even if it will be the best reform in the world, but if it will be one reform, it will not work. Firstly, I have to say that we lost power, but not because of reforms. Party, Slovak Democratic Christian Union, the Zurinda's party and my party, we did 6 out of 7 biggest reforms, which means it was the most reform party. Our election result in 2006, after being 8 years in one row in government, after doing all these reforms, it was the best in history, even better than in 2002. But we have a lot of parties, we have proportional system, if we were not able to create majority coalition after 2006, but only because our partner, Christian Democrats, who were with us for 8 years, they rejected to join us and to create coalition. Which means there's good evidence that it doesn't mean that if you are doing radical reforms, it means political suicide. Second point, despite Fico, who won the election and became prime minister, he built his political strategy on devastating criticism of all reforms. He said that he will cancel every one reform which we did. He did nothing after taking power in 2006. Because in 2006, 2010, he just did some cosmetic changes to don't lose his face. But he inherited the record-growing economy, record-growing public revenues, which means he could be crazy to cancel anything. And then we returned to power, but only for less than 2 years. Then he became again prime minister in 2012. And in this second term, he changed something. He really deformed some reforms. But very important is that still, for instance, flat tax was cancelled. Now we don't have the same rate and one rate only. But still, after cancelling this flat tax rate, the tax system is still much, much, much better than before 2004, because it was also cleaned from all exceptional deductions. It sustained. Pension reform. We imposed the strongest second pillar in all regions. 9% of wages people paid for that. He reduced it significantly to 5% only, which means it is much less than we passed, but still it is the strongest in the region, because in Hungary they cancelled at all, second pillar, in Poland as well. Which means, yes, unfortunately, Fico's government is destroying and deforming some of reforms, not all of them, but some of reforms. But still, it is better than it was before. I don't regret any reform. If I regret something, that maybe the communication was not more effective. We did what we could, you know. Time is limited, capacities are limited, but maybe the communication. I mean, to send more empathy to people, because this was what Fico misused. He said that, you know, reforms are cruel and this kind of, and it was not true. We can show on the figures that it was not cruel, that it bring immediate positive result. But in politics, much more important than reality is perception of the reality, is how people feel it. And those critics and populists convinced people that reforms were cruel. Because finally people understood that they were successful. They were proud of this. We were then enter Eurozone and so on, growing economy, reform leader, Tatra Tiger and so on. People were proud of this, but they thought it was too radical, it was too cruel for them, which means to show also more empathy, more understanding for the people's fears, for why people are afraid.